Well, thank you very much, and welcome to Broadway Buzz. I'm Joe Garry, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Sleeping Beauty. Now, this is an extraordinary work by Matthew Bourne. Matthew Bourne is probably the most celebrated choreographer of his day. His work is seen in every major dance capital of the world. He has conquered the West End, and he has also conquered Broadway, winning a Tony Award for Best Direction and Best Choreography for Swan Lake. He's an extraordinary artist who not only is a brilliant choreographer, but a brilliant storyteller and director. You're about to see a show that is visually stunning. It integrates set, costumes, it treats space the way a sculptor would. It's visually as devastating as the greatest movie you've ever seen. He's a master, and he's most of all a brilliant storyteller. So what he has done is taken the classic tale of Sleeping Beauty, and he's turned it into a sort of Gothic romance that spans 100 years. And it will incorporate large numbers of dance techniques and ideas, and it's an extraordinary cavalcade of dance and storytelling at its best. It's also a wonderful reminder, you know, we say that dance is the mother of the arts, meaning that long before we had language and long before we had formal storytelling, we had dance. And dance in its simple and most primitive form told a story, created a sense of energy and spectacle and mood through movement. It integrated all of the arts with music, chanting, and then visual storytelling. And in the same way, Matthew Bourne goes back to these ancient roots in dance and is able to vivify a story in an extraordinary way. Okay, let us go back to the legend then of Sleeping Beauty. We know we have large examples, many examples of famous people sleeping in legends. There's Brunhilde and there's Rip Van Winkle. But keep in mind, in the story of Sleeping Beauty, I'm going to tell you part of the legend that I'm sure your grandmother didn't tell you when she said, "Once upon a time, long ago and far away, there lived a beautiful princess." And this is, of course, a classic story. A princess, a spell is put on her, she sleeps for 100 years, she's kissed, of course, by a prince, and lives happily ever after. Well, let me give you some variations of this ancient tale. The tale goes all the way back to the Egyptians, it goes all the way back to the Greeks. We see references to it in the major Greek work called the Panchatantra. There are examples in Asian literature of this sort of sleeping beauty. So narcolepsy is really ancient, just so you know. And when you say you have insomnia, you know, this is the reverse of that, so just think of the Sleeping Beauty. But there are parts of the tale that I'm sure you don't know. Keep in mind, in the 17th century, Charles Perrault, who was a French aristocrat. This is a period of tremendous enlightenment in the French culture in the 17th century. The arts are all being cultivated in a very elegant and dignified way, and there's a reverence for great art in this period. But Charles Perrault decided, being one of the great intellectuals and being one of the great aristocrats of his day, he had tremendous power. And he decided one of the greatest gifts he could make to art was to take some of these ancient stories that have been passed on in an oral tradition and writing them down. So literally, we say that Charles Perrault was really the father of the modern fairy tale, and beginning the story with once upon a time, long ago, and far away. And he took the stories of Cinderella, he took the stories of Bluebeard the pirate, he took the stories of Puss in Boots, and most famously, he took the story of Sleeping Beauty and he put it down in a very elegant literary form. Just so you understand how in that period, in the 17th century, the oral tradition was still very popular. So women, French aristocratic women, would meet in a salon And one of the great chic things to do in that period would be for the women to tell famous stories that they had all grown up with, that their mothers had told them, that their grandmothers had told them. But they would tell the story, which would ultimately be known as a fairy tale. They would tell the story and embellish it with elements of their period, their idiom, their time frame, so that it would become a very French story. If the story was told in Germany, the same thing would happen, but it would have a very strong German idiom. So the end result was Charles Perrault borrowed what these women were doing in the salon, telling these very elaborate tales, and he wrote them in a very elegant literary form. It's ironic that all of the stories that he put down have remained our basic fairy tales. Keep in mind, about 150 years later, the brothers Grimm in Germany would take those same stories and they would put them in a German idiom. But we all know the story of Sleeping Beauty. She's somehow pricked and falls asleep and sleeps for 100 years. A prince kisses her and she wakes up and lives happily ever after. But let me tell you other parts of the story that Grandma didn't tell you. There is a version of this story where the princess falls asleep, and while she's asleep, she is raped by a prince. She gives birth to twins, and how she wakes up is one of the twins is suckling on her thumb and pulls out the thorn that was in the thumb that had put her to sleep. When she wakes up, the prince reappears, he kisses her, they fall in love, they marry. But the part of the story you don't know is either, depending on the version you hear, either the prince had an ogre mother or an ogre wife who hates the new princess. So when they go to live happily ever after in the prince's kingdom, the ogre mother or the ogre other wife says that she's going to cook the children for dinner, and when that is done, she's going to cook the princess on the next night. But lo and behold, the prince foils all, and they all finally do live happily ever after. So, when we talk about the idea of Matthew Bourne sort of reworking this fairy tale, it isn't really very alarming. I mean, Walt Disney did exactly the same thing. Keep in mind, in 1959, when Walt Disney made the film of Sleeping Beauty, he changed a lot of elements within the story. Traditionally, the story has always been told that the princess sleeps for 100 years. In the Disney story, we don't really know how long it is, but it certainly isn't 100 years. And smartly, Walt Disney puts everyone to sleep so no one gets old and no one changes in the period of time. And also smartly, in the Walt Disney version, he introduces the prince to the story very early on so that we have a buildup of the love story. We don't just suddenly, at the end of this long story, have a prince appear and kiss the Sleeping Beauty and then they live happily ever after. He gives the central characters primary roles, and it becomes one of the definitive ways of telling the story. So what I want you to be aware of is this story has been told in countless ways, in countless cultures. It's been told as myth, it's been told as legend, it's been told as fable. But almost always what all these stories share in common is this sort of sweeping romantic quality of once upon a time, long ago. Romanticism always likes to deal with the exotic or the far away or lost in time, back in time. It also always loves to deal with the love story, and it deals with good and evil, and it always deals then finally with the idea of happily ever after. And even in the grimmest versions of Sleeping Beauty, finally, happily ever after does win out. So what I want you to be aware of is these stories are in everyone's culture and a part of all of our experiences. And so it's so interesting that Matthew Bourne would take this material and reimagine it in a very special way. But before we get to that, let's go through the rest of the progression. So we know it started as a series of fables or legends, was literally told everywhere in the world. It was Charles Perrault who brought it to the French culture, who elevated it by writing this very elegant prose. And then all of these early editions were beautifully illustrated. So keep in mind, as we grew up hearing these stories, we remembered the visuals, the drawings of the stories, as much as we did the beauty of the language. So Charles Perrault gave us a literary quality to fairy tales that we followed right to the present. Okay, the next major movement in the development of this story is what happened to it in dance and music. And there are a lot of examples of what happened through the 18th and 19th century. A lot of composers developed pieces of music. Poetry was written about the Sleeping Beauty. And then, of course, dances were created about the Sleeping Beauty. But this leads us now to Russia and the late 1880s going into the 1890s with the birth of Sleeping Beauty as a brilliant classic ballet. So we introduced then Tchaikovsky. And as you know, Tchaikovsky was one of the greatest Russian composers. He left us a body of magnificent ballets, symphonies, operas. You just have read a lot of controversy about his production of Eugene Onegin that just opened at the Metropolitan Opera. As you know, in Russia right now, they're opposing the idea, they're suppressing gay rights in Russia, and the world is sort of reacting to this. And activists in America and activists in the art world very strongly wanted the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Opera to take a very strong stand in opposing this idea of suppression of human rights. Tchaikovsky was clearly a homosexual, but the Russians have sort of rewritten history on this. And the Russian story of Tchaikovsky is that he was a man who was married but unhappily married, and that they focus on the brilliance of his work. Well, that's of course what they should focus on. There is a major film being made in Russia right now about Tchaikovsky, and it had large amount of government subsidy. And when they saw the script and realized they were going to deal with Tchaikovsky's homosexuality, the government withdrew all of the money for the project, ironically. But in any case, Tchaikovsky was in his prime in this period. And in this period, he would write then 3 of his greatest ballets. He would write The Nutcracker, Swan Lake, and Sleeping Beauty. And Sleeping Beauty would be his greatest masterpiece. When it was created, the music was so soaring, so lush, that it found tremendous success all over Europe and literally around the world. And of course, Tchaikovsky's ballet music is some of the most memorable classic music we have in the world. And even though you may not follow classic music, the moment you start hearing a Tchaikovsky melody, not only does your hair stand up and do you have goosebumps, but of course you can almost hum the remaining part of the melody. So the end result is Tchaikovsky was in his prime in this period, writing great works, and it's when he wrote Sleeping Beauty. He also had a brilliant interpreter of his music, and the man's name was Marius Petipa. And Marius Petipa was the great choreographer of the day and Russia's leading choreographer, and he created this sumptuous, visual, brilliantly arresting classical ballet of Sleeping Beauty. It was almost 4 hours long. But keep in mind, poor Tchaikovsky, in his lifetime, he never achieved the success he should have. Ironically, 10 years after his death, when the first time they played Sleeping Beauty in Russia, he was summoned to the Tsar's box after the ballet, and the Tsar said, "Quite interesting." And of course, this was a 4-hour masterpiece to go on to become one of the greatest ballet, classical ballet in the world. So it was only after Tchaikovsky's death that his work took on the prominence and success that it did, and primarily those 3 great ballets, the Swan Lake, Nutcracker, and Sleeping Beauty. So there is this legacy now of some of the most brilliant and soaring music ever written for a ballet that was created for Sleeping Beauty. And this is all now the background for Matthew Bourne creating his work. Okay, let me talk a little bit about Matthew Bourne for you. Matthew Bourne is an extraordinary choreographer. He's English. He was raised in London in a very middle-class family. The mother and father would save money to take their son to see the musicals of the day. So as a young boy, he was treated, of course, to some of the greatest musical entertainment in that period in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, when all of the great American musicals were finding their way to England. And Matthew Bourne, as a young boy, was also addicted to movie musicals. And so even as a child, he had never had any dance training. He didn't have any dance training until he was 22 years old. But as a boy, he so loved dance, and he had so memorized all of the movie musicals and the West End musicals that he would promptly come home and get his friends, badger his friends, into creating the dance moments from all of the movies and musicals he saw. And he had sort of this memory that was so intense that he could recreate these dances really quite accurately. And so he would take his young friends and sort of badger them into creating these dance routines. A show that had devastated him was the movie of Mary Poppins. And so his friends for the next 2 years were presenting sequences from the Mary Poppins movie. So not having any real training in dance, he knew that this was going to be his life. If we were to say what inspirations were there in Matthew Bourne's life, there were two great Freds in his life. Sir Frederick Ashton, who was one of the great choreographers of modern ballet, and he of course made an incredible impression in terms of English ballet, and he elevated it to one of its highest points, and Matthew Bourne had seen all of his ballets. And the other Fred in his life was Fred Astaire, and he loved the way, the elan, the grace, the charm, the casualness, the ease with which Fred Astaire would dance. So keeping that in mind, think of that as you watch the show tonight. Matthew Bourne will borrow from ballet and borrow from the traditions of ballet in the same elegant and visual way that Sir Frederick Ashton would create all of his ballets. But in the same way, there is a charm, a grace, a sensualness, a casualness, a sexiness to the way he creates sort of modern dance that is very much in the style of Fred Astaire. So it's interesting that this young man who would become the most celebrated choreographer of his day would really have started his life by loving the movies and by loving the Broadway musical. And in the same way, remember in America, Balanchine was one of our great ballet masters, but he moved into the musical theater. And when Balanchine moved into the musical theater, he brought with him all the discipline and all of the elegance and all of the grace of ballet, but he added to that then the idea of modern dance and theater dance and created an extraordinary new kind of dance. And that's really what you're going to be seeing in Matthew Bourne's version of Sleeping Beauty. Now, let me just give you some guidelines for seeing this. One of the things that's very important to realize about Matthew Bourne is that he is a brilliant storyteller. And keep in mind, dance doesn't have the option of speaking to you in language. You know that when we see a musical, we have so many ways of moving the story forward. The language, the dialogue, the lyrics of the song, all of this moves the story forward. But we, of course, remember in great musicals like West Side Story that we'd finally understand the power of dance and the fact that dance could really tell the whole story. In West Side Story, the most exciting moments happen in the dance sequences. And so it's the integration of dance and that soaring music. And so in that same way, that's what's going to propel you through this show, Matthew Bourne's ability to make dance so visual and so visceral for you that the music comes alive in the telling of his tale, in his version of the story. Okay, so let me just give you some background. So Matthew Bourne then started out by really having no significant dance training. He's 22 years old. He's worked in London selling theater tickets. He worked in the bookstore at the National Theatre. He always had to be around the theater and around theater people, but he never found a way of getting in. So finally, friends talked him in to enrolling in a dance school. And it was a 4-year Bachelor of Arts program in dance. This is very unusual in England. In America, we have a lot of university-oriented dance programs, but in England, this is not typical. So he signed up at the Laban School for Dance, and he's 22 years old, never really having any formal dance experience. And in the 4 years, he was taught by a large number of American choreographers living in England in that period. So he was exposed to all of the great contemporary American dance ideas, from Jose Limon to Balanchine, a whole range of ideas in terms of how dance could be executed in a modern way. When he graduated, he was 25 years old, and he started his own company, and they worked sort of out of a little van, and they carried little pieces of scenery around, and there was a small group of dancers performing, and Matthew Bourne would create these very sort of innovative stories. From the very beginning, he was always creating story dance, and watch for that. It's so amazing. When you leave this show, you're going to be able to talk about it on such a sophisticated level, and you're going to say to yourself, how did I get all this information? I mean, it's only told through the visual of dance, but he turns movement into a kind of language, as of course the ancients did. Okay, so here's Matthew Bourne, early on struggling, doing very innovative dance, but I mean, again, this was very hit and miss. Everybody in the company had part-time jobs to keep themselves together. They'd perform in school gymnasiums, etc. But it was very clear that this was a very innovative choreographer who had very interesting ways of telling very compelling stories. And I mean, we know in our love of the musical theater, I mean, you see a Broadway musical that was choreographed by Bob Fosse, and you immediately recognize it. You recognize his style. You recognize the interesting way he used the body, the sort of angular ways he used the body. And in the same way, Matthew Bourne had this sort of signature of making everything so unique and very special in the way he developed the work. How his career really took off was really kind of a coincidence. He received a call from an opera company called Opera North, and they were putting together a tribute to Tchaikovsky, and they were going to do a one-act version of a Tchaikovsky opera, and they wanted to do a very offbeat version of Nutcracker. As you know, Nutcracker has gone on. Every dance company in the world supports themselves by doing a month of the Nutcracker at the holiday time. And so we've seen the Nutcracker, you know, we think, how many more times can we see these sugar plum fairies? So anyway, the end result was that Matthew Bourne said, I've got a whole different way to tell this story. And he told it in a sort of dark, gothic, camp way. And it was really absolutely outrageous. But by doing it for this opera company, for Opera North, suddenly, you know, he wasn't dealing with only 6 or 8 of his little dancers. He was dealing with a large orchestra. He was dealing with expenses that an opera house has. He had to be able to work within the framework of this very expensive mechanism, an opera house, and he created this extraordinary, very offbeat, funky, camp version of the Nutcracker that sort of became an instant classic. The next season moved to the Sadler's Wells Ballet Company in London, where it sold out and it became sort of an institution of seeing Matthew Bourne's funky version of the Nutcracker. But this brought Matthew Bourne into the world of ballet. And Matthew Bourne probably early on when he was interviewed never expected that he would have any exposure in the ballet world. His world was clearly modern dance. And keep in mind, when a choreographer works in ballet, he has a whole language to use. I mean, ballet has very particular steps, movements, positions, etc., extensions, and so you work within a very particular rarefied language, dance language. And Matthew Bourne really didn't have that exposure. His exposure was to creating his own dance language. So once he did the Nutcracker, this opened his mind to Tchaikovsky, and he realized the brilliance in that music, and he realized that his imagination fed very well into the world of Tchaikovsky. And so his next major effort was to mount a production of Swan Lake. And again, Swan Lake is one of the most famous ballets in the world. We know that soaring music, and it's so connected with the visual of beautiful ballerinas in tutus on point, dancing this exquisite dance. And the end result is, when Matthew Bourne took it over, he totally transformed it. The corps de ballet, the group of elegant, beautiful swans that we've been seeing in our minds for literally 200 years, suddenly now was going to take another life. Matthew Bourne decided that the swans, the corps de ballet, should be danced by men rather than women. And instead of women in tutu on point, we had men bare-chested in very sensuous costumes, moving in very masculine, threatening ways, as swans really do. And the end result was he created one of the most controversial events that ever happened in the modern ballet world. When Swan Lake first opened, it went on to be one of the most celebrated ballet in the world. But when it first opened at Sadler's Wells, poor Matthew Bourne would stand at the door when people would leave. Outraged mothers would scream at him, and little girls would cry because they didn't see tutus, and it was not the world of Swan Lake that they knew. It was as though he had created a desecration. And at first, everyone thought this was going to be a disaster until the reviews came out, and the reviews said, definitive, innovative. We've never heard the Tchaikovsky music before. It's visually stunning, it's daring, it's bold. And it was Cameron McIntosh, a great producer, who came to him and said, get this show out of Sadler's Wells and move it to the West End. So they moved it to the West End, the commercial theater zone, where we have big musicals, and it took off and became an enormous success. It moved to New York, where, as I told you, it swept the Tony Awards, winning Best Director and Best Choreographer, and became the longest-running ballet in the history of the world. One of the experiences you have, and if you know this music from Swan Lake, you're going to walk away from this in the same way, saying, I feel like I've never heard this music before. And this is a tribute to Matthew Bourne, because what he's been able to do is to create visuals, new visuals, not the kind of thing you're accustomed to seeing in Sleeping Beauty, but new visuals that will make you re-see and reimagine the show, the story, and most importantly, the music. And you get to celebrate the music in this very special way. And you realize, of course, in ballet, how much the visual affects how we hear the music. And so in watching this with the stunning collaboration that he has with his set designer, costume designer, and lighting designer, is that he creates these compelling visuals that are so stirring and so indelible that they stay in your mind. So very quickly, what you're seeing is a total reworking of the story. We know that the original ballet was written in 1890, so that's when Matthew Bourne starts his story. So it begins in sort of a Victorian Gothic way. Keep in mind, this is a period when people still believed in fairies and goblins and sprites, and of course Dracula was the most important literary innovation of the day in that period in the 1890s. So he sets the opening, Act 1 of the ballet you see, takes place in 1890 with the birth of Aurora, the princess. Watch the brilliant way he treats the baby in this show. He makes the baby dance. Only Matthew Bourne could do that. He makes the baby dance in the most extraordinary way. In Act 2, we're in the Edwardian period. We're in 1911. Beauty is just ready to grow up and become a woman. And so we're in this period of high Edwardian elegance, of lawn parties and croquet on the lawn, and this kind of elegance. It's out of a Merchant Ivory film. So the first act is very like the original ballet with all the exotic dancing and the dancing of the fairies and the pas de deux and all of the wonderful combinations of introducing the good fairies, bad fairies, and I might add vampires in this case. So this is a ballet with a bite, I do have to tell you. All right, so in any case, the second act is in the Edwardian period, elegant, beautiful, totally different feeling of dance. This is when waltz is king, and also this is the period when the castles in America were creating the castle walk, and so all of those ideas are used. In the third act, we're into the netherworld, the world of beauty sleeping. This is sort of the Isadora Duncan period. And then finally, the fourth act is the reawakening of beauty, and we're in modern times. So it's an extraordinary work that spans 100 years. It incorporates the best of dance, the best of lighting and scenery. And Matthew Bourne certainly belongs in a Broadway series. As you know, he was the choreographer of Mary Poppins. He did the revival of Oliver and My Fair Lady. He's an extraordinary artist who's comfortable in so many worlds. So you're in for a very special treat, and enjoy the show. Thank you.